The day the HOA decided to throw a picnic on my property, I had no idea how wild things were about to get. It wasn't just any land, they had no clue what they were stepping into. See, most people don't realize what lies just beyond the fence lines in quiet neighborhoods like ours. To them, it's just grass and trees, maybe a few birds chirping. But on my land, there's a whole other story waiting to be told. I've always kept my property a bit different. While the neighbors fuss over trimmed hedges and perfect lawns, I've been nurturing a sanctuary. Not the kind with fancy garden gnomes or manicured flower beds, but a real sanctuary for animals that need space and respect. And yes, that includes some creatures most people wouldn't expect in a suburban neighborhood like grizzly bears. Legal, well cared for, and under strict regulations, but still bears. For years, I kept this secret close. Not because I wanted to scare anyone, but because I knew how people could react. Most wouldn't understand. They'd see the bears and call for the authorities or worse, try to do something reckless that would put everyone in danger. I made sure the bears were safe, the fences strong, and the area well marked, but mostly out of sight. So when the HOA announced their community picnic and chose my land as the perfect spot, I was stunned. No heads up. No permission. Just a big sign going up and neighbors being told to bring their blankets and snacks to my place. The irony was thick. I wanted to laugh, but honestly, my heart raced. What if someone wandered too close? What if things got out of control? I decided to watch from a distance that morning. I hid behind the trees as families arrived, kids running around, neighbors chatting, and grills firing up. It looked innocent enough, but all I could think about were the bears. Calm, majestic creatures, but still wild animals that needed respect and space. As the picnic got underway, I noticed something odd. A group of kids was edging toward a part of the land I'd marked as off-limits. The signs were clear, but kids rarely pay attention to signs. One boy picked up a stick and poked near the fence line, laughing with his friends. My stomach tightened. I knew I had to do something fast, but I also wanted to avoid causing panic. I stepped out quietly, calling out to the parents nearby. Hey, that area is off-limits. Please keep the kids away. A few heads turned, surprise and confusion mixed on their faces. They didn't know about the bears. I kept my tone calm but firm. No need to cause a scene, just a clear warning. That moment changed everything. Suddenly, the picnic atmosphere shifted. People whispered, eyes scanning the tree line, some nervously asking questions. The HOA board members looked flustered, realizing they'd made a huge mistake by not checking with me first. But here's the thing, this wasn't about scaring people or stirring trouble. It was about respect and responsibility. The bears were protected by law, and I followed every rule to a T. The problem was the HOA's reckless decision, treating my land like a public park without any regard for what lived there. As the day went on, more questions came up. How did I get grizzly bears here? Was it safe? What if one escaped? I answered each carefully, explaining the permits, the safety measures, and the routine checks I did. Some neighbors listened quietly, others still looked uneasy. Meanwhile, the bears, calm as ever, watched from their enclosures, completely unaware of the chaos nearby. They had no idea their presence was causing a neighborhood uproar. I thought about how strange it was that something so natural, so powerful, could become a symbol of conflict. By late afternoon, the picnic wound down. People packed up their things, conversations buzzing with new energy, part curiosity, part caution. I could tell the HOA was already scrambling behind the scenes, planning how to fix the mess. As I walked back toward the barn, I felt a strange mix of relief and frustration. The day had shown me just how little people understood about living alongside nature, even when it was right in their backyard. It was a lesson in respect, boundaries, and the unexpected challenges that come when worlds collide. That picnic wasn't just an event on my land, it was the start of something bigger. The beginning of a story about standing firm, protecting what matters, and reminding everyone that sometimes, what's hidden beneath the surface is more powerful than it seems. After the picnic fiasco, the tension in the neighborhood didn't just fade away, it grew thicker. The HOA members tried to act like nothing had happened, but the truth was out. People were whispering behind closed doors, sharing stories, and asking questions they never thought to ask before. How had such a big event been planned without any warning? And more importantly, why hadn't anyone known about the grizzly bears living right next door? I started getting phone calls and messages from neighbors, some curious, others cautious, and a few downright worried. They wanted to understand how I could legally keep grizzly bears on my property, and how I managed to keep everyone safe. It wasn't an easy question to answer, but I explained everything: the permits, the safety protocols, the strict regulations I followed, and the care the bears received every single day. The bears were not wild threats running loose, they were part of a carefully maintained sanctuary. The more I talked, the more I realized how little people actually knew about living close to wildlife, even when that wildlife is legally protected and well managed. Most of my neighbors had only seen animals like squirrels or deer around their yards, never a creature as massive and powerful as a grizzly bear. This fear and misunderstanding fueled a lot of the drama that followed. Behind the scenes, the HOA was scrambling. They held secret meetings, trying to figure out how to handle the situation without making things worse. Their usual tactics, sending letters, fines, or threats, wouldn't work this time. The community had seen through them, and the issue had become bigger than just a few angry neighbors. At one point, a few board members came to my door, trying to negotiate a way to keep their events away from my land. They were careful with their words, acting like they cared about safety and community harmony. But I knew it was mostly about damage control, trying to avoid legal trouble and bad publicity. I didn't want to fight for the sake of fighting. I wanted respect and understanding. My land was my sanctuary, and the bears were part of that. I told them clearly that any future gatherings would need my approval, and that safety would never be compromised. The community's reaction was mixed. Some neighbors supported me fully, admiring the way I stood up for my property and the animals. They even helped spread the word about living responsibly with wildlife. Others were still uneasy, worried about what having grizzlies nearby meant for their children and pets. That fear was understandable. Grizzly bears carry a reputation for danger, even though these ones were far from the wild. I made a point to open the lines of communication, inviting neighbors to learn more, visit from a safe distance, and ask questions. Education was key. I organized small, controlled tours for those interested, showing how the bears lived, how their enclosures worked, and how I ensured no harm could come to people or animals. It was slow at first, many were hesitant, but bit by bit, minds started to change. Meanwhile, the HOA tried to push back. They sent letters claiming I was breaking rules, violated zoning laws, or was a danger to the community. I responded with proof of permits, inspections, and expert opinions. The legal ground beneath their accusations was shaky. Local authorities got involved, checking to make sure everything was above board. The inspections were thorough, and the results always came back clear. I was operating within the law, protecting the bears and the neighborhood alike. That didn't stop some neighbors from spreading rumors and fears. Social media posts painted the story with exaggerations, causing even more confusion. I realized that managing perception was just as important as managing the bears. So, I kept sharing facts, answering questions, and showing transparency. Over time, many of the fears began to fade. People learned that the grizzly bears were not wild threats roaming free, but carefully cared for animals living safely behind strong barriers. The picnic incident had sparked a bigger conversation about property rights, safety, and the relationship between humans and nature. It challenged the HOA's control and made the neighborhood question what community really means. Through it all, the bears remained calm, their presence a reminder of nature's power and the responsibility that comes with it. Their quiet strength was a steady contrast to the noise of the ongoing conflict. What started as a chaotic event had turned into a growing movement, neighbors coming together to protect their homes, support one another, and respect the boundaries that keep everyone safe. And as the sun set each evening behind the tall trees surrounding the barn, I felt a quiet confidence. The land was mine to protect, the bears were part of that protection, and the neighborhood was waking up to a new reality, one where respect for nature and community could finally find balance. The weeks after the picnic incident brought a wave of unexpected changes. Suddenly, My property wasn't just a quiet piece of land with some grizzly bears, it had become a symbol of something much bigger. People started paying attention, not just the neighbors, but others beyond our little community. Some were fascinated, others concerned, but everyone had an opinion. The spotlight was on me and the bears, whether I liked it or not. One afternoon, I found myself sitting on the porch when a car slowly rolled by, its windows down, neighbors watching cautiously but curious. It wasn't just casual interest anymore, it was as if my land had turned into a local landmark. That was when the calls started, journalists wanting interviews, bloggers asking for details, even wildlife experts reaching out to discuss the unique situation. The pressure grew, but I stayed grounded. I knew my priority was keeping the bears safe and protecting the neighborhood. The bears weren't just animals to me, they were part of a careful balance I'd worked hard to create. I reminded myself that their well-being and the community's safety came first, no matter the noise around us. The HOA tried to regain control, sending official notices and proposing new regulations aimed specifically at my property. It was clear they wanted to push me out or at least restrict what I could do. But this time, the neighborhood alliance I'd started was ready. We knew our rights and had legal advice backing us up. We weren't going to let intimidation tactics work again. Tensions were high at the next HOA meeting. It was packed, standing room only, with neighbors from all sides showing up. Some voiced support for the bears and my efforts to protect them. Others voiced fears, concerns, and frustration with how the situation had been handled. The board struggled to keep order, but the community was no longer willing to stay silent. I listened as people spoke about safety, responsibility, and respect, both for the animals and for the people who lived there. It wasn't always easy to hear criticism, but the conversation was necessary. It was the first time in years that the HOA felt real pressure to listen, to change, to be accountable. Outside those formal meetings, the neighborhood itself was shifting. People were planting more trees, creating buffer zones between properties, and thinking differently about the space they shared. The bears' presence had sparked a deeper awareness of the natural world around us, something many had taken for granted before. I started inviting neighbors to small workshops about wildlife safety and coexistence. These were informal gatherings, held on weekends, where we talked about how to live alongside animals responsibly. I shared stories about the bears, their habits, behaviors, and the work involved in caring for them. Slowly, mistrust began to turn into curiosity, and curiosity into respect. One day, a local school reached out, asking if I could host a field trip. At first, I was hesitant. I wanted to keep the bears' environment as calm as possible. But I saw the opportunity to educate the younger generation, to inspire a respect for nature that could ripple out beyond our community. The visit was carefully planned and supervised. Children learned about the bears' strength and gentleness, the importance of protecting wildlife, and how humans and animals could share space without conflict. Watching their wide eyes and thoughtful questions reminded me why this fight mattered so much. Meanwhile, the bears seemed unaffected by all the attention. They moved slowly through their enclosures, resting in the shade, oblivious to the drama surrounding them. Their calm presence was a steady heartbeat in the chaos, a reminder of the balance I aimed to maintain. The legal battles with the HOA dragged on, but each challenge strengthened our resolve. We gathered evidence, documented every interaction, and made sure our voices were heard in meetings and courtrooms. The fight wasn't just about property lines anymore, it was about community, respect, and the right to coexist with nature. Some neighbors who had been skeptical began to join the cause, realizing that protecting the bears also meant protecting the neighborhood's character and values. It was a slow but powerful shift, a community coming together to defend something unique and important. At night, when the world quieted down and the bears settled under the stars, I often reflected on how far we'd come. The property that once felt isolated now buzzed with connection. The fight for respect and safety had opened doors to new friendships, new understanding, and a shared commitment to protect what mattered. This wasn't just my story anymore. It was ours. The bears, the neighbors, the land, we were all part of a living, breathing community shaped by courage and care. And as the days passed, the future looked different. Not just a battle to win, but a chance to build something better, stronger, and and more respectful than before. After months of back and forth with the HOA, the situation reached a new level. The board decided they couldn't ignore the issue any longer, and they began to bring in experts, lawyers, wildlife specialists, and local officials to try and find a way to resolve the conflict. It felt like a turning point, but also a reminder of how complicated things had become. The experts came to inspect the property, walking every inch of the land where the bears lived. They examined fences, safety barriers, and even the daily routines I followed to care for the animals. Their questions were thorough and sometimes challenging, but I welcomed the scrutiny. Transparency was key to proving that I wasn't just hiding behind rules, I was actively protecting both the bears and the community. Some neighbors showed up during these inspections, watching quietly from a distance or asking polite questions. The mood was different now, less fear, more genuine interest. The presence of these professionals brought a sense of seriousness and legitimacy that even the most skeptical couldn't ignore. In the days that followed, reports were shared, outlining the safety measures and legal standings. It became clear that I was operating within the law, and that the bears were secure and well cared for. The HOA board members who had pushed hardest against me began to lose steam, their arguments falling flat in the face of cold facts and expert opinions. But even with the official support, the tension didn't disappear completely. Some neighbors still felt uneasy, worried about accidents or the what-ifs of having grizzly bears so close. It was natural to be cautious, but I worked hard to keep the lines of communication open. One afternoon, I invited a group of neighbors to join me for a walk around the perimeter of the property. We talked about the fencing, the safety protocols, and how the bears were trained to avoid human contact. I wanted to show them everything, not just in words, but in real, tangible ways they could see and understand. Their questions were thoughtful. What happens if a bear gets loose? How do you feed them safely? Are there emergency plans in place? I answered each honestly, sharing details about alarms, backup systems, and coordination with local animal control. This wasn't just about easing fears, it was about building trust. The more people knew, the more they realized the bears were not a threat, but a responsibility that I took seriously. Slowly, the community's mindset began to shift from suspicion to cautious acceptance. Meanwhile, word of the story spread beyond the neighborhood. Local news outlets picked it up, sharing the unusual tale of an HOA picnic gone wrong and the grizzly bears quietly living next door. I was surprised by the attention, but also grateful for the chance to set the record straight. Interviews allowed me to talk about the importance of respecting private property, the legal protections for wildlife, and the balance needed between human communities and nature. I emphasized that this was not about defying the HOA, but about living responsibly and safely. Some people reached out with support letters, messages, even donations to help with the care of the bears. Others criticized, but I was prepared for that. Standing firm meant accepting both praise and backlash. Through it all, the bears remained calm. They went about their days eating, resting, and exploring their space. Their peaceful presence contrasted with the human drama unfolding around them. They were a reminder that nature has its own rhythm, steady, patient, and enduring. The HOA eventually agreed to halt any further plans to use my land for events without explicit permission. It was a small victory, but an important one. Boundaries were being respected, and a new understanding was taking shape. Community meetings became less about confrontation and more about cooperation. Neighbors started talking about ways to make the whole neighborhood safer and more connected to the natural world. Some even proposed planting more trees and creating shared green spaces. I saw people start to appreciate the wildness that existed just beyond their yards, the way birds sang differently, how the wind moved through the trees, and how the bears had become part of that environment. One evening, as I walked along the fence line, I noticed a group of kids quietly watching the bears from a safe distance. They were curious, but calm, and I smiled knowing that this new generation was growing up with a different perspective. The journey wasn't over. There were still challenges ahead, legal battles to fight, and fears to address. But what had started as a conflict was becoming a community effort, a chance to rewrite what it meant to live alongside nature, even when that nature is as powerful as a grizzly bear. Each day brought new lessons about patience, respect, and the unexpected ways people and animals can share space. And as the sun dipped behind the tall trees, casting long shadows over the land, I felt a quiet hope stirring. The bears were safe. The neighborhood was changing. And something new was growing here, something stronger than fear, rooted in understanding and care. The months that followed brought even more unexpected twists. Just when I thought the situation had settled into a new normal, things started shifting again, this time in ways I hadn't anticipated. The bears, the HOA, the neighbors, all of it felt like it was moving towards something bigger, more complicated. One morning, I woke up to find a notice taped to my front gate. It was from the HOA again, this time claiming that my property was violating new community guidelines. The notice was vague but threatening, implying fines and possible legal action if I didn't comply immediately. I knew the HOA was grasping for any reason to pressure me, but this felt different. They were stepping up their game. Instead of reacting impulsively, I took a deep breath and started documenting everything. Photos, emails, letters, phone calls, I kept records of every interaction. This wasn't just about protecting my property anymore, it was about standing up for the truth, no matter how complicated the fight became. At the same time, I noticed more neighbors approaching me not just with questions, but with offers of support. Some were frustrated with the HOA's heavy-handedness and saw my situation as a sign that the board was out of touch. Others were simply curious about the bears and wanted to learn more about how I managed the sanctuary. I decided to host an informal gathering in my yard, an open invitation for neighbors to come by, ask questions, and see the bears' environment up close, from a safe distance, of course. It wasn't a big event, just a chance to break down walls and build connections. That day, a surprising thing happened. People came not in anger or suspicion, but with genuine interest. Parents brought their kids, asking how the bears were cared for. Some elderly neighbors shared stories of living close to nature before the neighborhood grew. It felt like a community coming together, not tearing apart. The conversation shifted. Instead of focusing on rules and restrictions, we talked about responsibility, respect, and the challenges of living alongside wildlife. I shared how much effort it took to keep the bears safe and ensure they didn't become a danger. I explained the fencing, the emergency plans, and the daily routines. Most importantly, I showed them that this was a labor of love, not defiance. This openness helped change the mood. People started to understand that the bears weren't some wild threat, but part of a carefully managed sanctuary that respected both animal welfare and community safety. The fear began to fade, replaced by a cautious respect. Meanwhile, the HOA's attempts to pressure me intensified. They sent more letters, held meetings trying to pass new rules specifically aimed at limiting what I could do with my land. But each time, their efforts were met with resistance from me and from neighbors who had come to support the sanctuary. The legal battles became a tug-of-war, draining time and energy, but also forcing the HOA to slow down and rethink their approach. Community members started showing up at meetings, demanding transparency and fairness. The board was no longer able to operate behind closed doors as they had before. Behind the scenes, I worked with attorneys to ensure every permit was up to date, every safety measure documented, and every complaint addressed properly. I wasn't just defending my property, I was setting a precedent for responsible coexistence with wildlife in a residential area. One day, a local wildlife organization reached out, offering assistance and guidance. They were impressed by the care I gave to the bears and wanted to help educate the community further. This partnership brought fresh energy and new voices to the conversation. We started planning workshops and informational sessions, bringing in experts to talk about animal behavior, safety, and environmental responsibility. These events became a platform to build trust and knowledge, turning suspicion into understanding. Neighbors who had once been wary began to participate. Some volunteered to help with cleanup days or planting trees around the property, creating a natural buffer zone. It was a tangible sign that the community was shifting from conflict to collaboration. Throughout all this, the bears remained the constant center of it all. They went about their days, unaware of the human drama swirling around them. Their presence was a reminder of the bigger picture, the wildness and wonder that coexist alongside our daily lives. One evening, As I sat watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized how much this journey had changed me. It wasn't just about defending my land anymore. It was about building bridges between neighbors, between humans and animals, between fear and understanding. The fight with the HOA was far from over, and challenges still lay ahead. But something new had been born, a community waking up to the idea that respecting nature means respecting each other. That night, I felt a quiet determination. No matter what came next, I was ready to protect the bears, my property, and the future we were all shaping together. The atmosphere in the neighborhood began to change in ways I hadn't expected. It was subtle at first, small conversations here and there, a nod of acknowledgement instead of avoidance when I passed neighbors on the street. But over time, it grew into something more meaningful. The tension that had gripped the community started to loosen, replaced by a growing curiosity and, for some, a genuine sense of respect. One afternoon, as I was checking the fences and making sure everything was secure, a few neighbors approached me cautiously. They weren't confrontational. Instead, they asked questions about the bears. What did I feed them? How did I keep them safe? Was it true that they never left the property? These conversations were different, they showed interest, not fear. It became clear that knowledge was breaking down the barriers between us. When people understood the measures I took, the double fencing, the security cameras, the alarms, they saw the bears less as a threat and more as part of the land's story. The stories I shared about each bear, their history, their personalities, helped humanize them in a way, making it easier for neighbors to see them as creatures deserving care rather than danger. But it wasn't all easy. There were still lingering concerns, especially from families with young children. I respected that. I invited them to visit the sanctuary's safe observation points, where they could watch the bears without risk. These visits were eye-opening. Many neighbors admitted they had never seen a bear up close before, and the experience changed their perspective. They saw strength and vulnerability in equal measure, and it deepened their appreciation. The HOA board, sensing the shift in community opinion, tried to regain control. They proposed new rules and restrictions, hoping to limit my ability to care for the bears and restrict access to my property. But the community stood firm. At the next HOA meeting, neighbors spoke up in my defense. They shared stories about the workshops, the educational visits, and the way the sanctuary had become a unique part of the neighborhood's identity. The board members were surprised. Their tactics to isolate me weren't working anymore. The community had grown more united, and their voices carried weight. It was a turning point, proof that collective understanding could overcome fear and division. Meanwhile, the bears themselves continued to thrive. Their routines stayed steady, oblivious to the human conflicts swirling around them. Watching them in their natural rhythms reminded me why this all mattered. They were not just animals on a piece of land, they represented something larger, the possibility of coexistence. One day, a local wildlife biologist visited. She was impressed by the care and safety measures in place and offered to help create a community program focused on wildlife education and safety. This was exactly what the neighborhood needed, a way to bridge gaps and foster respect. Together, we started organizing monthly sessions where people could learn about local wildlife, how to live safely near animals, and why preservation mattered. These sessions became popular quickly. Parents brought their kids, eager to teach them about nature. Some neighbors even volunteered to help maintain trails and clean up the natural areas around the neighborhood. It was becoming clear that the bears were catalysts for a bigger change. They inspired conversations about nature, responsibility, and respect that rippled beyond my property lines. The neighborhood was slowly becoming a community, connected not just by proximity but by shared values. Yet, challenges still surfaced. Occasionally, misinformation spread, rumors about the bears escaping or being aggressive. Each time, I addressed these fears head-on, providing facts and inviting skeptics to visit and see for themselves. Transparency became my strongest tool. Through it all, the sanctuary grew not just in terms of bears, but as a symbol. It represented the struggle to balance human development with the wild world, the fight to be heard, and the hope that understanding could replace fear. In quieter moments, I thought about how close we had come to losing it all. The picnic incident, the HOA's threats, The fear, it could have destroyed everything. But instead, it sparked a movement. People who once saw the bears as a problem now saw them as neighbors. Walking through the sanctuary at dawn, watching the bears roam peacefully beneath the rising sun, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment. This wasn't just my victory, it was ours. The bears, the neighbors, the community all connected in a new way. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more hurdles, more skeptics, and more surprises. But for the first time, I felt hopeful. Hopeful that respect and education could change minds, that coexistence was possible, and that the land and its wild residents would be protected for years to come. As time went on, the relationship between me, the bears, and the neighborhood grew more complex. What started as conflict slowly turned into a cautious alliance, with moments of tension still bubbling under the surface. But those moments were fewer now. People were beginning to see the sanctuary not just as a problem to solve but as something unique, a part of our shared environment that demanded respect and understanding. One morning, as I was doing my rounds checking the security systems and fences, I heard voices nearby. Curious, I walked over and found a small group of neighbors gathered at the edge of my property. They weren't there to complain or argue, they wanted to learn. They asked if I could explain how the sanctuary worked and what it took to care for the bears safely. I welcomed them in and started sharing the details, how each bear had its own personality, the training they received to stay within the boundaries, and the daily routines for feeding and health checks. I talked about the specialized fencing designed to keep them safe inside, and people outside, and how alarms and cameras monitored everything around the clock. Their eyes widened as I described the level of care involved. It wasn't just about putting bears on the land and hoping for the best. This was a carefully managed sanctuary, a place where wild animals could live peacefully without threatening the human neighborhood. Afterward, one of the neighbors said quietly, "I never realized how much work goes into this." Another added, "It makes me feel better knowing you're watching out for everyone." That moment, those simple words, felt like a breakthrough. Word spread about these informal talks, and soon more neighbors were stopping by, eager to understand the sanctuary better. Some brought questions about safety, others were curious about the bears' behavior, and a few simply wanted to see the animals up close, from a safe distance. These visits became regular. I set up designated viewing spots where people could watch without disturbing the bears or putting themselves at risk. Seeing the bears move, play, and interact helped neighbors overcome their fears. They began to appreciate the sanctuary not as a threat, but as a rare chance to connect with nature in their own backyard. At the same time, the HOA's attitude was shifting. They could no longer deny the growing support I had from the community. Attempts to impose new restrictions faced pushback not only from me but from neighbors who saw the sanctuary as an asset rather than a nuisance. During one HOA meeting, a surprising number of residents spoke out. They shared stories about how the sanctuary had changed their view of wildlife and brought the neighborhood together. The board members, once confident they could push me out, now found themselves facing a united front. Behind the scenes, I worked tirelessly to maintain all permits and safety measures. I collaborated with local wildlife experts to ensure the sanctuary met the highest standards. This professional approach made it harder for the HOA to argue against my presence on legal or safety grounds. The bears themselves continued to be the silent heart of the story. Watching them grow, thrive, and adapt was a constant reminder of why this sanctuary mattered. They weren't just animals on a patch of land, they were ambassadors for the idea that humans and wildlife could coexist when respect and care were the foundation. One evening, I noticed a group of teenagers gathered near the sanctuary fence. They were quiet, watching the bears with fascination. I approached and offered to answer their questions. They told me they'd been hearing stories about the bears and wanted to understand more. We talked about wildlife conservation, the importance of respecting natural habitats, and how fear often comes from not knowing. They shared their own experiences of hiking nearby trails and spotting wildlife. It was encouraging to see a new generation becoming curious and respectful of the natural world. That moment was a reminder that this journey wasn't just about me or the HOA. It was about shifting attitudes, building knowledge, and planting seeds for future coexistence. But challenges weren't gone. Occasionally, rumors about bears escaping or attacks would surface, stirring old fears. Each time, I responded quickly with facts and invited people to see for themselves. Transparency remained the strongest weapon against misinformation. Slowly, the neighborhood started changing. People took more interest in local nature, planting native trees and flowers to attract birds and small animals. Some neighbors even started their own small gardens, inspired by the sanctuary's connection to the wild. The sanctuary became more than a property, it became a symbol. A symbol of resistance, resilience, and the power of understanding. It showed that even in a place governed by rules and regulations, there was room for wildness and wonder. As I walked the land each day, watching the bears roam beneath the tall trees and open skies, I felt a deep sense of purpose. This was about more than keeping the bears safe. It was about protecting a way of life, a vision where humans and nature could exist side by side without fear or conflict. The road ahead still held uncertainties, legal battles might flare up again, neighbors could change their minds, and nature itself would always bring surprises. But for now, there was hope. Hope that this fragile balance could last, and that the story of the grizzly bears and the neighborhood would be one of respect, care, and unexpected friendship. And with every sunrise over the sanctuary, that hope grew stronger.